we've been going through a sort of dark ages for the left. And for basically my entire lifetime, it's been a fairly thankless task to be a leftist, almost sort of like a rearguard action. I don't know who's going to win here. We're up against some very powerful forces, but I feel like we have a fighting chance of reforming society, of building something better.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater Dubé, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater Dubé, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
Welcome to the Goldwaters. We are back after a short summer hiatus, and today on the podcast we have Daniel and Dr. Samantha. How you guys doing?
Great, Dan. Great to be here.
Yay.
So today we're going to have a chat about the dirtbag left. Now, it sounds mean, but we're not talking about a pejorative here. It's kind of a semi-ironic badge of honor that's been coined by members of the left, progressives, to describe this, I guess, a new, more vulgar form of left-wing politics. Daniel, this was something that you wanted to table, the dirtbag left. What brought you to this issue?
I'm politically confused, Dan. I found that this last election in the States really made me reflect on my political history and where I've been, where I've come. I mean, I think I may have mentioned this on this podcast before. I was very right of center. I would watch Fox News and listen and read the Spectator magazine, and was one of the only guys at Concordia that supported the intervention in Iraq, and thought that George Bush Jr., while maybe a little dim, was still a lovely guy. That's kind of where I started as a young person, of all things. And as I've grown, this last election, I was really into Bernie Sanders. So there's really been a big journey. I chose this topic because I found something provocative on the left, and this sort of dirtbag left. And I wanted to explore it and see if there's hopes that it will animate the left of the future.
Let's get to our special guest. Ethan Cox is the editor-in-chief of ricochet.media. This is an independent, crowd-funded progressive outlet based out of Montreal. Ethan, welcome to the Goldwaters.
Thank you, Dan. Pleasure to be here.
First, what do you think of the topic? So we're not going to spend this time insulting progressives, but addressing the concept of the dirtbag left, and how many progressives themselves believe that, well, the left should be a bit more radical, a bit more engaged, maybe even inspired by the alt-right. Can you start there about sort of the state of progressivism in your eyes, Ethan, and whether or not you think the left should borrow some tactics from the alt-right?
Well, not borrow tactics from the alt-right, but I think the dirtbag left is a reaction of frustration, and I think it's part of a much broader phenomenon. What we're seeing is that for so long, the terrain of political debate has been really strictly prescribed, very strictly policed, that there's only so far left you can go. And certain concepts, anything to the left of what's known as liberalism in the United States broadly, was just completely off the table. And what we're seeing now is the coming of age of a generation in millennials who no longer accept those rules, who don't want to be liberals, who see almost as much flaw in the corporatist Wall Street supporting Democratic Party in the United States, for example, as they do in the Republicans. And for the first time in the next election in Canada, millennials will be the largest voting bloc. It's the first time that's ever happened. It's been baby boomers as long as, most of us have been alive. And so we've talked about millennials and their interests for a while, but everybody says, oh yeah, but are they going to vote? And now we see in England that millennials really came out. They came out to vote. They're strongly engaged in the political process, and they want very different things. They're frustrated. They're not able to find jobs. They're really struggling with the state of austerity in Western governments. And and I think that some of this dirtbag left thing is a reaction to constantly being told what is and isn't acceptable in political discourse. And young people look around and say, you know what, like there are politicians who are extremely polite, who are making decisions that kill people, that kick people off of health insurance, that take benefits away from poor people. That's the violence. That's what we should be outraged about, not if somebody raises their voice, not if they call somebody a nasty name. And I think people really have not quite twigged to how fast this change is happening. Millennials are far more left-wing than they have been in the past. We're moving into an era of increasing polarization, but I think it's also very clear if you look around that the dominant political current among millennials is left. It's not right. The alt-right gets a lot of attention, but it's a very small number of actual people. What we do see is polling showing that policies like nationalization, which never would have been something you could talk about for years, helped Jeremy Corbyn do so well in the Labour election. Free education, free healthcare in places that don't have it. Left-wing policies are supported by massive numbers of millennials. They're starting to vote, and they're starting to get really angry because they feel that they've been screwed over by previous generations that have deprived them of opportunities here.
Daniel, Samantha, what's your take on the state of progressivism, and do you think the left needs to step up its game a little bit more?
Well, I think that the right's been having a lot of fun. I mean, beyond just the alt-right, and which I agree with you, Ethan, is maybe an overstated sliver of the electorate on the right. They also have going, the momentum that they were building off of has been conservative shock radio. That's been a huge thing in the States for about a generation now. And you have characters like Rush Limbaugh and then Coulter, who, for all that they're vicious SOBs in my humble opinion, they're having a lot of fun, a lot of vicious fun. And I've never really seen that on the left, and I'm speaking as a millennial and someone whose politics, I don't, want to pigeonhole myself, but I'm not a traditional leftist by any means. But growing up in these times, I have been growing more and more leftist, I do have to say. I mean, I was a kind of a Bernie bro in this last election, something that I never would have thought because I was more of an Alex P. Keaton type when I was younger. And I find that, what infuriates me often with the left is kind of twofold. Like, one, to the points that Ethan, you were just talking about, more like the sort of structural realities of what my generation is facing, that there are real economic challenges that we have, and that's something that needs to be addressed when there's more and more of my generation living at home and not having the same economic prospects of a generation ago. Again, I'm also speaking just to the aesthetics of it, though. Again, the fun of it all. Like, I don't see on the left people. I mean, that's why Bernie, to me, was a breath of fresh air, is that he was actually talking about more classic socialist perspective. He was kind of, identity politics were kind of like second tier to his discourse. It was more about the haves and the have-nots, and maybe some what perceived by some as more like radical socialist sort of projects. But again, the fun parts, we're talking about the dirtbag part of the left here. And I don't see enough of that out there, and I want to see more of that. And so that's something that I'm hoping will galvanize. I mean, what I've seen out there on the dirtbag left, I mean, there's the Chapo Trap House podcast that we've discussed and some other pundits. I find it really encouraging and exciting. It's no longer genteel and, we go high and they go low, and I start to roll my eyes. So that's my sort of spin so far.
I guess from my perspective, I've in terms of temperament and politically, like, I've always tend to skew more centrist, more middle of the road, and even just in terms of my training. Even as a psychologist, my job is still to reach consensus, is to reach agreements between people. And my experience professionally is, antagonism doesn't really work. It's just not effective. And it's something that I've always really focused a lot on, is effectiveness. Like, what's going to be most effective to get your agenda across? So when they go low, we go high, as a mantra, as a thing to put out there, appeals to me. It sounds very pleasing to me. I listen to it and I think this is great. This is like I want to teach my kids. And it just seems like a better way to be able to persuade and to reach consensus and to be effective on a very basic level and to have a sense of shared humanity. That said, the more getting into the one trend in the left that I find has becoming more and more difficult personally for me to kind of wrap my head around is the morality police. and I find it something that I can wrap my head around to a certain extent around the identity politics, and just, okay, well, don't be a jerk, don't piss people off. If people want to be called a certain pronoun, or if they want to appear a certain way, or if they want to talk about toxic masculinity, then great. We're just, I'll just be on the same side. That's fine. There's no reason to antagonize. But there's a certain point where what I appreciate in the dirtbag left is that this is the millennials. We still grew up on South Park, on Family Guy, on a lot of irreverent, sarcastic, ironic humor. It just seems like it's a distraction, that it's just creating infighting. That so instead we're just going to be, on the left, we're just going to be policing ourselves and saying, well, who's the more valuable? Who could I virtue signal most to? And who could I say is the most valuable? Instead of focusing on, well, what are the real issues? And the one thing that so that's one thing I appreciate in the dirtbag left, and also kind of shifting a lot of the focus towards economic inequality, and that's really. Those are really the puppet masters. That's really what's happening behind the scenes. So while we're on stage kind of bickering about who used the right terms and who's morally upstanding enough and who's centrist enough and who's consensus making enough, there's the puppet masters in the back that are really pulling the strings and are using this as a distraction from what's really going on.
And I also get the sense sometimes that all the sort of identity politics that have kind of really risen, I think, over the Obama years, not because of him, I would say, but just it's been a reality. We've seen the rise of trans rights and sort of things coming into mainstream lexicon like intersectionality and really sort of undergrad level expressions to define social strife. I find a lot of these debates are kind of clickbaity. Like, let's be honest. Like, I find it's like BuzzFeed level discourse about what ails society. I find like, if you're going to see a headline that talks about a trans woman is denied access to a bathroom. I'm not trying to say it's not a worthwhile, sad issue. It needs to be explored and needs to have restitution and justice. But at the end of the day, it's a more exciting thing to read and click on than talking about, say, trade policy or talking about, rent control. Like, there are some things that you're talking about, Samantha, maybe sort of, puppet master issues or economic realities. It's just not as exciting in the, the 500 to 1,000 words that people have to discuss issues on the internet today. And I find that's, I think, part of what accelerates this identity politics. We're just kind of spectators to something that's kind of fun to think about, which is not necessarily a top-ranking issue.
Well, yeah, and I think that's the main thing. And so I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with, or inherently anything wrong about being respectful and being respectful of where people are coming from and their identities and how they present themselves and how they want to live and navigate through the world. I think those things are great and fantastic. And I think getting into implicit bias and things like, I think these are all fantastic, and intersectionality, I think these are all fantastic constructs to explore and to get into and warrant a lot of, thoughtful deliberation and introspection. But it seems almost like it's besides the point when there's such bigger issues that are going on. And I take to your earlier point that, one of the things that's fun in the dirtbag left is that it does make it more clickbaity. So it does give a way to be able to make economic and social inequalities just kind of sexy and fun and something that you want to click on. Do I think it'll be effective? I don't know. That I don't know. I'm not really sure how having two sides just yelling obscenities at each other is really going to do anything. But hey, I'm interested in watching the ride.
Ethan, you have experience on both sides of this issue. I mean, you are an editor, so you do have to sort of get the clicks once in a while, but you're also a union organizer. Do you see sort of a shift on the left from, going out there and being militant and getting onto the streets to sort of a more clickbaity, more populism-driven sort of form of activism?
Well, the left's been a mess for a long time, let's be honest. But I think that, we set up identity politics and class politics as being in opposition or in contradiction and having to choose and saying, are we going to focus on identity politics or are we going to focus on class politics? And I think that ignores something fundamental, which is that the root of the problems that we're talking about when we're talking about identity politics, whether it's the conditions of black and minority people, of sexual minorities, all of these things come back to economic issues. That's the root of all of these problems. So when we're talking about oppression and exploitation, we can't really extract the class analysis from it because what we see now is capitalism trying to address these critiques by saying, okay, well, look, now we have, a black person on our board. We have more women in our executive suite. So now everything's fine. But there's still a massive gap between what men and women are paid in that company. There's still not access to opportunities for black people. So simply adding minorities to the executive suite in an oppressive and exploitative system doesn't change anything. And so I think that's what people are coming around to realize, is that the economic issues are inextricably linked with the identity issues. And you don't have to choose. You don't have to say, well, I care about class, therefore I don't care about Black Lives Matter, or I don't care about trans rights, or any of these things. It's all part of the same package. And if we want to have a more egalitarian and just society, then all of these considerations have to be taken into account. And we have to be especially concerned about people who have historically been more marginalized and more oppressed, but we do have to address it in a holistic way. And when you're talking about the situation, for instance, of black people in the United States, economic issues are the number one thing. That's the issue. That's the problem. The only way to change anything is economic policy. It's not better representation, although that's great and I support it. It's not everything.
I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I do feel that if to sort of maybe mirror back what you're saying, if I have it right, that identity politics sort of downriver from class politics. It's that, yes, they're inextricably linked. It's sort of a false dichotomy to say it's one or the other. Though once you heal the class rifts and the economic needs, then the needs of minority rights start to be satisfied. And I find, when I look at least in the American analysis, my perspective on it is that it's sort of like, if you go way back in the 20th century on the left, I mean, for the New Deal, then you have like Great Society programs under LBJ. So it's like 2 generations in between those 2 major legislative achievements to try to deal more with the class perspective, trying to essentially redistribute wealth. And I don't know, since then, we had they had the Clintons, which essentially gave up on the welfare state and went more neoliberal and more centrist to try to appease corporate interests. I mean, that's the grand narrative. And under Obama, who I think was a wonderful president, I mean, a classy guy, but I don't see that there was any major sort of traditional socialist program that he instituted. Again, it was more the language of Black Lives Matter. There was the Great Recession that he was presiding over, and all these big bankers pretty much didn't really have to get much in terms of punishment. There was no major response to that. I mean, there's still CEO pay still manages to increase day by day, and the proportion between the chasm between the haves and the have-nots is still increasing. So that's where I do feel that maybe identity politics kind of started to grow more front and center, perhaps, over this last sort of left-wing ascendancy, if you want to call it that in the States, a Democratic ascendancy over 2 administrations. Like, I didn't see any major, more traditional socialist initiatives. I think that's why the thirst for someone like Bernie was growing.
Well, it's old school divide and conquer, right? The elites in the United States have for decades pitted the white working class against minorities, against the black and Latino working class, said, hey, look, these are the root of your problems. Your wages are going down, your benefits are going down, everything about your life is getting worse, but that's not the fault of the people on Wall Street. That's not the fault of your bosses that are lowering what they're paying you. That's actually the fault of these black people or these Latino people who are coming and stealing your jobs, taking your welfare, all of these things. And that's the rift that needs to be healed. And the broad interests of the white working class and the majority of black and Latino people in the United States are very, very similar. But as long as the elites are able to continue to divide and conquer, then it's going to be very hard to actually address those issues. And to come back to this dirtbag left issue, I think that what we're seeing here is that for many, many years, youth culture was really nihilist in its orientation. It was all about doing things for the lulz. It was all about meme culture, jokes. It was very divorced from politics. And at the same time, you saw the left that was really dour and as you say, very focused on, I think, good things. I think it's important to make sure that people are conscious of issues of race and gender and everything else. And I think it was very important that we went through that process of trying to improve there. But it did create a disconnect between young people and the political ideals that most naturally responded to their concerns. And now I think with the dirtbag left, we're seeing those things come back together. And people that grew up doing it all for the lulz saying, you know what, it doesn't have to just be for the lulz. Like, we can still do the same stuff. We can still have fun, make jokes, make fun of people, rip on people, and we can do that with a social purpose in mind. And I think that's what Chapo Trap House and the dirtbag left are embodying, is that nihilist youth culture now sort of growing up and saying, well, actually, we can and we should get involved in society and try and change things because they don't work for us.
But Ethan, tell me, because my perspective, and maybe my perspective is too narrow, that in the crosshairs on the dirtbag left tend to be the sort of liberals again, sort of neoliberals, and I don't necessarily see a full offensive on, say, alt-righters or on people. I mean, they're kind of disregarded as just idiots, and that the real targets tend to be sort of left-wing sellouts. It tends to be where the enmity is targeted, and I'm not sure how conducive that is to a united left going forward. Am I accurate on that?
Well, it reflects a frustration, I think, that is widespread with young people, that no matter who you vote for, you get the same policies. And that's really, I think, the root of young people's frustration with democracy, and why a lot of people haven't voted in the past and don't vote, is that no matter what you do, here in Quebec, we elected a PQ government after years of liberal rule. The same austerity policies got brought forward on the federal level now. After 10 years of Stephen Harper, we have a Trudeau government that's actually continuing most of his policies, using his same climate policies. And of course, in the United States, the Democrats have become so much a corporate party, so close to Wall Street, that they haven't had any appetite for single payer healthcare, for these issues that are really important to young people. And so I think what you see on the dirtbag left is people that feel they have to reclaim the left before they can fight the right. That right now, liberalism is what stands in the way of actually implementing left-wing policies. I think left-wingers are happy to have an honest, forthright debate with right-wingers that are honest about what they want. I think what young people are really mad about is this whole class of liberals who talk as if they really care about all of these issues, who profess support for all of these things, but when it comes to actually doing anything about it, they're completely unwilling. And so I think a lot of people see that as the block, that liberal control over the mainstream left has to be broken. And what we're seeing in the United States with the rise not just of Chapo Trap House, but of Jacobin Magazine, a lot of these other things, is there is a real left again. And there hasn't been for years. For years, liberal was as far left as it went. When I first signed up for Facebook, I remember that very liberal was the most left-wing political option, from the drop-down. They've since changed it so you can write on your own thing. But that was as far left as the political spectrum went in the United States. And so I think the left now is standing up and saying, you know what, we're here, we exist, and we are very different from liberals. We are not just a clientelist Wall Street party that wants to protect abortion rights and minority rights. We actually have a big platform for radical change, and that platform is getting increasing support and interest from younger people.
Well, then, but I guess to sort of build on what Daniel's saying, because I do think that there is a crisis within the left. Frankly, I think there's also a crisis on the right, but that's for a different podcast, a different talk. But is that going to unify the left? Because part of the dirtbag left is, yes, shifting towards focusing on, and again, as far as I understand, is that a lot of the focus is on shifting towards economic policy, and really shifting much more towards socialism, and saying, all right, so again, sort of changing, so not turning off the dials on identity politics and other things, but just maybe turning it down a little bit and turning up some of the economic concerns, so that they're both relevant, but really stressing a lot of class and economic inequality. But by going at it from a dirtbag perspective, and really, and I share your view, Daniel, that a lot of the focus tends to be on antagonizing liberals rather than focusing too much on what the right is doing, or what other groups are doing. Then it just becomes, it could be a great recruitment tool for formerly nihilistic millennials, but is that really going to bring liberals into the fold by antagonizing them? And where liberals do still hold more control over the political establishment as it is.
Well, if I could jump in for a second here.
Sure.
I mean, sometimes it's funny when, Ethan, you were just talking about when you joined Facebook, and the most left it was very liberal, and like, where's the socialist, the anarcho-syndicalist? It's almost like a branding challenge on the left. Like when I speak, even using the word socialism, I always feel like the air is sucked out of the room. Like people are like, oh God, there's like an eye roll, like waiting by people, not necessarily who are, even in my own generation. It just seems like a sort of a spent sort of historical doctrine that people don't really, they see it as young person nonsense. And that's why, alt-right, a term popularized by Richard Spencer, right, the white nationalist, was a conscious branding effort, right? It was to try to create something new just by rebranding with the new expression and making an old sort of, again, historically spent idea, essentially, white nationalism, cool again. And I wonder sometimes, again, I don't even want to identify as socialist because I feel like it's I don't know, not cool enough. Dirtbag left, just the expression itself is kind of more jaunty and fun, although having dirtbag in it is difficult to be taken seriously by political classes. And so I wonder sometimes if, well, at least to respond to your point, that at least, Samantha, what I'm seeing at least in this dirtbag left movement is an effort at least to rebrand. Like they're talking about socialism, they're talking about the same sort of ideas, but without using the expression. And maybe it's a very minor aesthetic detail, but I think it has a lot of power.
It is being used. Socialism has been a dirty word for so long, and that's changing faster than I think anybody could have anticipated. When Bernie Sanders ran for president, the first and biggest knock against him was, look, Americans will never vote for somebody who professes themselves to be a socialist. And it didn't quite turn out that way. He was able to get massive support. There was a poll in Iowa, I think, that showed that a majority of people under 40 identified themselves as socialists rather than capitalists. So I think the reaction to the word socialist changes massively depending on how old you are. And young people don't remember the Cold War, don't identify it with the Soviet Union. They identify it in a more abstract sense with the policies. And it's a catch-all for the policies that they're seeking. So I'm not sure that socialism, I think in 5 years, there's going to be none of that. Like it has been a dirty word for a long time. That's changing really fast. And I think very, very quickly, it's just going to go away because, the right were so frustrated with Bernie Sanders. They thought, we got our ace in the hole. We just have to throw the word socialism at him and his support will collapse. And I think you saw a lot of people on the right going, what's going on? Our dog whistle doesn't work anymore. We used to just be able to call people socialists, and this guy's calling himself a socialist, and we can't take him down over it. And that in and of itself represents, I think, a complete sea change from just 5 years earlier.
Well, wait, let me just check in for a second. Dan, are we going to need to bleep socialist throughout this? Because I realized it was used a lot in this podcast. Are we okay with that?
We may have to bleep it out.
Okay.
It's sensitive to our corporate partners. Ethan, one question: if we are to assume that the dirtbag left is a tactic, is a temporary measure to attain a certain level of equality, a certain level of economic fairness, would you argue then when we reach that point, the left will collectively dial it back?
I think if we look at what we're talking about in terms of Chapo Trap House, I don't really see it as lacking in civility. I think lacking in civility is inciting people towards violence against each other. I think that what we're talking about here is simply being rude to people who are not used to being challenged. And I think that's a very different thing from lacking civility. I think a lot of the actions of the people that are criticized by people like Chapo Trap House are completely lacking in civility. And I think that's what part of this is trying to expose, is that we demand civility in the discourse, but not in the actions. And there are a lot of uncivil actions going on. And how do you challenge that other than with incivility, with criticism? And criticism used to be a really strong intellectual tradition. And if you go back throughout human history, hundreds of years in the past, people would go at it with each other. They would criticize each other's ideas. They would attack each other. And I think that's good. I think that's needed. So I don't really see it as such a bad thing. I don't see it as a descent into a terrible place. I think you look at the alt-right and you see a lot of things that are really worrying to society at large. I don't think it's analogous, and I think we draw a lot of false analogies, but I think it's a mistake to compare, neo-Nazis parading in the streets, which is basically what the alt-right is, with the fact that there are some lefties on a podcast who call people mean names, I think there's a difference there.
Well, I agree that there is a very big difference. Absolutely. But we're still, I guess, and again, this is a very personal thing. I find that once you're resorting to calling people names and referring to, I was listening to Trap House podcast where they were referring to someone with their big dumb face or their big stupid head or something, right? Which is funny, sure, but it just seems to me like that's the recourse when you don't have a real argument, and it just seems you're not going to get people to come in on your side other than for the lols at that point. And so I do think that there's some valid points being made, and I do think it's important in the field of ideas to be able to be. For lack of a better word, to have a brutal debate, to really tear those ideas down and build them back up and see what happens and see what comes out there. I think that's fantastic and something that I think is how societies are built and maintained and grow. But by just throwing in that guy's a stinky face, it kind of, I don't see what that's adding to the dialogue, and it seems like it's just a distraction.
But this is one, we shouldn't also overstate the influence, right? I mean, this is
sure,
one
yes.
territory on a battlefield, let's say. I mean, when I think, say, of South Park Republicans, when I was younger, I was affected by that expression. I kind of self-identified as such, and there were Matt and Trey Parker through South Park, a vulgar show, critiquing both left and right in different ways. And, that kind of casts seeds. That's not necessarily a political action committee in any way, but it does maybe sort of influence, again, maybe younger minds over time. These ideas sort of take root, might get sort of brought into civil discourse and are brought into political power at some point later on. So when I listen to, again, Chapo Trap House, it's a bit of an echo chamber too. It's not like they're bringing anybody on there, say, from the other side to really debate these ideas and have a more, say, Oxford-style debate. I mean, and they're not pretending to. I mean, they are what they are, and I find it very... It's entertaining, but at the same time, through that sort of calling people names, they're also discussing real structural economic issues from a leftist perspective, without it being like Noam Chomsky level kind of bore.
And you mentioned earlier this idea of is this an effective way of building a broad tent, of getting to a position to win? And I think that touches at really one of the core issues here, which is that people my age have grown up their entire lives being told you have to vote for the lesser evil, and you have to sublimate everything that you want and just accept the slightly less worse option. And
yes.
and this is a reaction to that, of saying we have absolutely had it, because it's not actually a compromise. It's never a compromise. It's a certain elite that is saying, well, you have no choice but to vote for us because look at those crazy people over there. And so I think the left is saying, you know what, that's really dangerous and damaging and destructive, and we get none of what we want through that approach. So we have to develop an independent identity, and we have to, go to war with the establishment left, the establishment liberals, for the soul of what it is to be progressive. And I think that's what you're seeing right now is, who gets to make these decisions. And for so long, it's been run by baby boomers. And now millennials are coming of age and saying, you know what, your policy ideas, your ways of getting things done don't work for us. We want more radical change. And the way to get more radical change is not to try and conciliate with everyone. Right? I mean, one of the really funny issues here is we talk about politics as if the people that voted in the last election are 100% of the people that can vote. But we forget all of the people that don't vote. And so what the left is doing around the world, most recently in England with Jeremy Corbyn, is saying, you know what, instead of focusing all our attention on people that are in the middle, instead of focusing all our efforts on winning over swing voters that are in between the left and the right every election, we're going to go in the other direction. We're going to move to the left, and we're going to pick up people that have never voted before. We're going to get them registered. We're going to get them out to the polls, and that's how we win. And as somebody who's worked in politics before, as somebody who works, as a strategist in a lot of contexts, that makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to say you can win more by mobilizing and firing up your base, by getting them out into their communities, bringing more people to the polls. You can put more ballots in the box doing that than you can playing this endless game of triangulation to try and catch 2 or 3% of the population that waver between the two parties. So I think the left is staking out a different way to win. For so long, it's been about that. It's been about forget everyone that doesn't vote. Millennials, forget them, right? Politics, everything about politics has been designed to say young people don't matter because they don't vote. And the left is saying, you know what, if young people actually did vote, then they really would matter. And we wouldn't need to worry about those people that are stuck between the parties and that enforce this sort of status quo consensus. And fundamentally, young people are really angry. Things are really messed up right now. And minuscule change around the edges is simply not going to cut it, is simply not going to respond to that desire. So people are saying, look, we need radical change. How are we going to achieve that? And I don't think that you can achieve it by playing brokerage politics with the elite. I think that the only way to achieve radical change is to mobilize the grassroots. And I think that's what we're seeing around the world.
Yeah, but to mobilize them and inspire them to get out the vote is sort of, I guess, the $64,000 question. You know, when I think of the Bernie movement, I mean, much hay was made of the Bernie bros. This is a sort of young, angry white men, for the most part, who are kind of yelling the loudest. And I even noticed this part of the critique with Chapo Trap House. It's like, okay, 3 white guys who are really angry and sort of analytical. This is what I'm seeing in my generation. I'm concurring with you that socialism is becoming less of a dirty word. I wonder if you have to appeal to people on beyond identity politics. Again, I'm coming back to this because I think socialism that's what it sort of tries to be more race blind and identity blind. It tries to be more just about who has power and who doesn't. And I wonder if that language is more appealing to people who maybe are white and don't necessarily have. If you're a white male, you don't necessarily have the same challenges or the same headspace devoted to identity issues, so it appeals to you more. To focus, what do you think is going to motivate people to actually, in our generation, to go out and vote and register?
Well, first of all, I think the Bernie Bros thing is wildly overstated and essentially started as a slur from the Hillary Clinton campaign. There are really nasty people that support any candidate in any campaign in history. So if you're saying, well, you've got some nasty supporters on Twitter, join the club. Everybody does, right? And I think that this, Bernie Sanders right now is the most popular politician in the United States, including among black people, including among women, including among Latinos. So it's really overstated. But it is a vexing issue because identity issues are critically important. And I think everybody on the left agrees that we need to address them. Black Lives Matter is one of the most powerful and vital movements that we've seen growing in recent years. Idle No More in Canada has reshaped the conversation about Indigenous rights. And those are movements that are a big part of the left and are not anything that anybody wants to marginalize in pursuit of economic goals and chasing after the white working class. But you do have to separate between the fact that there is, as I said again, an attempt to divide and conquer, right? An attempt to set people against each other. And on the part of the elites, they want to maintain the status quo. And so the easiest way to maintain the status quo is to say, look, we're going to address these concerns through representation. There are going to be more minorities in films, in office suites, and all of these things, but nothing else will change. The conditions of 99% of black people will still be just as terrible. Black people will still get shot on the street by police because of the color of their skin, but we'll have representation. And that's what I think has to be pushed back against. We have huge problems in our society of racism, of sexism, and we desperately need to fight that. But we can't allow the drive for real and meaningful change that affects everyone to be sidetracked into a question of representation. I think if you're concerned with what's happening to black people, to women, then economic issues have to be part of that solution. I don't see how you actually change the systemic structural disadvantages for women, for black people, for other minorities without addressing economic issues.
I agree with you. Just I wonder sometimes if these issues like Black Lives Matter are a turnoff to swing voters who might otherwise be into more socialist policies and wealth redistribution. If you're a traditionalist in the States and you're a young person and you see your economic prospects are dim and you're starting to grow more interested in sort of a Bernie type program, but then you start seeing that's associated with Black Lives Matter, which maybe in that perspective might be seen as against police officers and might also be sort of in their perspective against sort of a traditional nationalist ethos, and then that might be a turnoff. I mean, there is sometimes, I find the two being mixed sometimes can turn off maybe, again, white working class people.
Well, look, I think that white working class people are being distracted, right? I mean, I like to say that if people have a right to be angry, and the white working class absolutely has a right to be angry because they are being screwed. If they have a good analysis and they understand who's doing the screwing, then they're angry at Wall Street. If they have a bad analysis, then they're vulnerable to demagogues like Donald Trump who misdirect that anger and say, no, actually, it's the Latinos, let's build a wall. It's the Muslims, let's ban them from this country. It's the transgender people in the bathroom. I mean, how ridiculous is all of this? But as you said earlier, it's clickbait. And the point is to distract people from the fundamental source of their suffering and discomfort. And so I think that the job of the left is not to accommodate that sort of latent racism, but it's to redirect the anger. It's to provide people with a better analysis and say, look, this is who's actually doing the screwing. And I think that it's more a question of education and of building bridges, because there's no way to win. There's no way to get the kind of substantial systemic change that I think a lot of people on the left want to see unless there's a coalition. Unless movements like Black Lives Matter, like Idle No More, like the LGBTQ movement are working together with white guys that are also angry about the way things are going.
Yeah, but to be very Machiavellian about it, though, I mean, to what extent does the left really need them? I mean, you talk about Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ rights. I mean, they're kind of in the pocket, right? They're going to vote left. Any sort of party that goes out, they have no other choice.
Well, or they just won't vote.
But I think those are two of the assumptions that have led the establishment left to the disastrous place that it is right now, right? Taking for granted voters on the left and saying, well, they have no other choice, so they're going to have to vote for us. And besides, they're probably not going to vote. That doesn't work.
And this is the art, essentially, is trying to figure out how to make everybody feel like they're in the same boat. And how to make people feel that, when they're not part of the 99%, how they can feel that we're in it together, we're being screwed together, and we need to unite and do something about it instead of bickering amongst ourselves.
I think what was really interesting about the Sanders campaign is that Hillary Clinton did quite well with black voters, won primaries in southern states with big black populations. But when you actually look at the numbers, Bernie won and won overwhelmingly among black voters under 40, among women under 40. So again, what we're seeing really is a generational split. The split is not really between black and white, between men and women. It's really generational. And people who are older are more comfortable with a more establishment politician like Hillary Clinton. And again, almost everybody under 40 is really dissatisfied with the way things are going for them and is really looking for an alternative. So I think whether it's Bernie Sanders or somebody in the same sort of vein, there are going to be leaders like that coming in the future, in the next cycle in the United States, that are going to be able to bridge those divides and bring people together. Because, I mean, look, you can't be on the left and say that you care about anything and say, you know what, yeah, police are like terrified of black people. They're just killing black people left, right, and center. But we're not going to talk about it because it's not politically expedient. I mean, that's what I think has gotten the left into such a big problem, that it's been sort of morally bankrupt for so many years.
Ethan, final thought. I take it you're fairly optimistic about the future of the left?
Yeah, I think I am. We've been going through a sort of dark ages for the left. And for basically my entire lifetime, it's been a fairly thankless task to be a leftist, almost sort of like a rearguard action. And I think we've all felt alone. And like maybe, we were a minority, we didn't matter, what have you. And I think what's happening now is people my age that are coming into their 30s are realizing that they're not alone, that the feelings that they have and the frustrations they have are shared really, really widely. And, I don't know who's going to win here. We're up against some very powerful forces, but I feel like we have a fighting chance of reforming society, of building something better. And I'm not sure I was completely convinced of that 10 years ago. So yeah, I'm feeling optimistic.
Further reading on the topic of the dirtbag left.
I'm going to, and we've mentioned it a lot on the podcast already, but I'm going to recommend checking out Chapo Trap House as the podcast. We've mentioned it a lot, but I think it's a nice way to get a little bit of a feel for what the dirtbag left is kind of bringing to the table, and I think it's worth exploring to get into those ideas and some of the humor in there it's very slapstick and a little silly, but it's still worth being exposed to and listening to in terms of what the focus is.
Yeah, there's a book that I've read recently, which is called "Rules for Revolutionaries," sort of a riff on "Rules for Radicals" by Saul Alinsky back in the '60s, and it was written by two of the architects of the Bernie Sanders campaign that specifically were in charge of their distributed organizing model. And it's really a manual, a guidebook for how to win elections on a grassroots populist platform and how to build support without the millions of dollars, without the massive institutional and structural support. And I think it's a very instructive look at where politics are going in these coming years as millennials become more influential and as hopefully money begins to have less of an impact and an influence on politics.
I don't know if this is way far from the dirtbag left, but I was actually going to endorse Grapes of Wrath. You could read the novel by John Steinbeck or watch the film with Henry Fonda. And it's funny because I watched it after, it's one of the top 100 sort of greatest films of all time by the American Film Institute. And I got into this in a context and I started exploring older music from Leadbelly and Woody Guthrie, and listening to these old American folk singers who were talking about socialist uprisings and union organization, and speaking about it in a way that is, listening to it sounds so profound and mature, and these were people who were representing real struggling working class Americans and were speaking unironically about organizing as a labor movement. And even to talk about that today sounds like just like an artifact of the past. And just to speak to Grapes of Wrath, it's just of people who don't know, it's about the Dust Bowl in the 1930s had devastated Oklahoma and a lot of other parts in the Midwest, and it's about a family that's trying to move to California for this sort of promise of economic of actually having jobs, because they were starving, and these were farmers who had no more prospects, and how they eventually are hoodwinked by all sorts of landowners as they go westward. And I think people should watch it today. It's just like plain and without sort of, again, the identity politics of today that I find just rears its shadow on so much left-wing rhetoric. It's very profound.
Ethan Cox, the co-founder and editor of ricochet.media, a Canadian progressive and crowdfunded media outlet. Thank you so much for stopping by, Ethan.
My pleasure.
Thanks for being here, Ethan. It was great having you.
Yeah, thanks, comrade.
And that's a wrap for today's show. Join us next time on The Goldwaters. Don't forget all the past episodes at thegoldwaters.ca. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's only a couple of ways that you can do that. Do give us a rating on iTunes or on your favorite podcast platform. You can also share it on social media, on Facebook or Twitter, #TheGoldwaters, and drop us an email with your thoughts. Talk@thegoldwaters.ca, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Samantha and Daniel.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks.